Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. You may have noticed we haven't uploaded much in recent times. That's because I am currently in isolation. After dodging it for 2 full years, I have finally contracted COVID. Our laws require that I isolate fully for 7 days at a minimum. This is day 5, so I'm very much on the mend and able to do things like record these videos, but it has meant that we've missed out on scheduled filming. So Charlene and I were going to do the weekend review. We had some other projects lined up. That's all been delayed, but as of next week, we will be back on normal schedule. Today, I want to talk about the changed strategy of the Russian Federation in Ukraine, why it's having some success, and the broader political implications thereof, particularly as it's playing out in the United States. But before I get into this, a couple of viewers have independently reached out and asked, have I seen this fundraiser in Lithuania by Andrius Tapinas? He is the founder of Laisvės TV. I'm sorry if I butcher the pronunciation. A Lithuanian TV station which has done this fundraiser to raise money for Ukraine, which many places around the world are doing. The difference here is specifically for a Turkish Bayraktar drone, an advanced weapon system credited with success across multiple theaters. The Bayraktar drone rose to prominence initially in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Turkey strongly supported the latter, and this weapon system proved decisive. It was useful in Syria with great success and against Russian forces directly in Libya. It was this latter instance that drew the attention of European countries, notably Poland and Ukraine. Both signed contracts to acquire the Bayraktar drone, including weapons platforms, electronic warfare systems, ongoing support and training. And now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, it's the Bayraktar drone that has proved among the most decisive and devastating counter-weapons that Ukraine has in its arsenal for destroying Russian armor. It's also proven surprisingly effective against the Russian Navy. It provided a significant support role in the sinking of the Moskva, the Russian flagship, and has crippled Russia's amphibious capabilities when it comes to things like Snake Island. And what Andrius Tapinas, along with thousands of predominantly Lithuanian donors, have achieved is the crowdsourcing of high-end weapon systems, which has never been done before. This required the approval of the Lithuanian government as well as the Turkish military sellers. That's unique in itself, but this represents a democratization of warfighting. It allows people to essentially raise mercenary forces outside the purview of national governments and nation states. So Ukraine is enjoying the support of governments around the world, the United States, Europe, Australia, and others, and they're getting huge influx of equipment, training, funds, various things to keep their economy going, but it's at the government-to-government level based on national interest. However, the civil society is now waging war against the Russian Federation, and I think this is a significant development, not just in this war, but potentially in other conflicts going forward. I'll monitor this with great interest. But as for this fundraiser, I'll leave links in the description below. I don't know if they're still accepting donations. A great credit to the Lithuanian people who, in addition to all the other burdens that they're shouldering to support Ukraine, are reaching deep into their pockets to provide high-end weapons platforms to keep the fight going. Extraordinary achievement, and thanks to the viewers who let me know about it. As for the rest of this video, it's important we discuss Russia's dramatically changed strategy and tactics, the effect it's having both militarily and politically. At the start of the conflict, Russia assumed that Zelensky would fall within a couple of days. He was running around 30% approval. There was a great distrust of the government among ordinary Ukrainians. The Russians assumed wrongly that there was great support for the ordinary people to join Russia, and that essentially if they marched towards Kyiv, everything would crumble in their way and they'd be welcome as liberators. Well, that proved obviously a total absurdity. I mean, the Ukrainians put up an extraordinary resistance with great morale and motivation, much to the surprise not only of the Russians, but it has to be said the rest of the world as well. They were extremely combat effective. As for Europe, they weren't divided. They all came on board on the same things. The sanctions went further and were more far-reaching against Russia than the Kremlin ever imagined possible. So Russia's isolation was near total. Its economy was punished, and its military losses mounted rapidly. And so Russia was on the brink of outright military defeat. What we've seen is a radical change, downscaling of Russia's aims and strategy. So they're no longer considering regime change or capturing Kyiv or overthrowing Zelensky. Those things have been abandoned. Russia has been defeated. Instead, they're now carving a line between west of Kharkiv down to the Black Sea, hoping to cut off the eastern part of the country, the Russian-speaking areas in Donbass and Luhansk. And this has multiple advantages for the Russian Federation. First, it cuts the supply lines, so it's right on Russia's border. It's much easier for Russia to sustain operations. Second, they can bring their heavy artillery to bear, which is a significant Russian advantage. And that artillery is not vulnerable because it's not deep in Ukrainian territory. It's much closer to Russia. And third, they can rely on a higher degree, not a majority by any stretch, but a higher degree of sympathy within those eastern parts that are Russian-speaking. But we're seeing a horrible devastation and loss of life. I mean, look at Mariupol. Russia has now captured what's left of that city, but there's been total devastation. There's also a political aim here. Russia is seeking to end the war. They haven't said this openly yet, but I do have Russian interlocutors who I speak with, and they're hoping to see this as a kind of bargaining chip, that the Russian government can take away some kind of victory, not be utterly humiliated in the war. But not only that, there are significant political centers in the west of Europe, particularly in France, but also in some parts of the United States that are calling on Ukraine to negotiate, to find a solution to stop the bloodshed and the violence. But they're basically arguing that it's now a stalemate. Ukraine has the military forces necessary to protect its cities. It has Stinger missiles and javelins and things that enable it to defend itself. But having the heavy armor required to prosecute an attack across open terrain towards east of Ukraine, right on Russia's border, well, that's a whole nother ballgame. And Ukraine currently lacks some of that military equipment. It is in the process of acquiring it, and it does want to take, understandably, all of its territory back and punish Russia for its unprovoked invasion and all the atrocities that are being committed. And so that's Ukraine's current objective. But if there is sufficient pressure from the other countries, if European countries and the United States say, look, Russia is trying to negotiate a solution, we can't just humiliate the Russian government. What we need to do is find a solution whereby the bloodshed ceases, we can start to rebuild Ukraine. Well, the pressure could be mounting on the Ukrainian government to essentially make peace under the threat that they will cease to receive ongoing military support and aid. Now, that is not the majority view in the American government. However, there is significant pressure among the American people. As a case study, it's worth looking at the $40 billion aid package that the US Congress has just passed to support Ukraine and keep it fighting. Well, in that debate, 11 senators, all Republicans, voted against the bill, plus 44 members of the House, again, all Republicans. While this still passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, these particular representatives have outsized representation among the American public. They're all basically Trump Republicans. Now, before people go, oh, Trump, it's worth understanding how Trump has altered American foreign policy. And it was only to bring it in line with the way most Americans feel. Because one of the things that gave rise to Trump, one of the big things, was the fact that the American foreign policy establishment had been an abject failure for decades. So the Iraq War was a catastrophe. Thousands of lives, trillions of dollars, nothing to show for it. We see Afghanistan and how that's ended. Syria, Libya, every foreign policy, every military intervention seems to have ended in disaster, and it's the American taxpayer that's been paying for it. Add to that, until recently, NATO was simply not pulling its weight. Germany was spending 1.3% of its GDP on defense. They had 35,000 American troops there defending them, a first world country, the largest country in Europe. And so Germany's defense was off the back of the American taxpayer, and the Americans were beginning to resent this. Now, when Trump was running, he got up in front of a bunch of Republicans and said the Iraq War was a catastrophe. He said it right in front of Jeb Bush. And this was one of the sacred cows of the Republican Party. You couldn't criticize American foreign policy adventures. And Trump just said what everybody on Main Street knew to be true. So it's in that context that they're deeply skeptical of another $40 billion to support a foreign policy war in this time in Europe, in Ukraine, a place where most people in America don't really know anything about, except to say that Trump was impeached because of a phone call that he had with Zelensky, and now suddenly Zelensky is supposed to be this great hero. So the Americans are deeply skeptical, not of the war in Ukraine, not because they want to support Putin or anything like that, but of their own government when it comes to spending their money in foreign policy wars that have very little to do with them as they see it. Now, this isn't true of all Republicans or even all Trump Republicans. I'm thinking of Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas. He came out and said, yes, the elites who are the stewards of American foreign policy over the past 2 decades have been an abject catastrophe. But this war in Ukraine is in America's interest for the Ukrainians to win. It's not in the American interest for Russia to take over Ukraine, to potentially wage war on NATO. That will drag America back in. Also, the United States needs to show that it is standing up for its values and its allies in order to deter China, and that a Ukrainian victory, a crushing Ukrainian victory, will give China pause, because that was just American support, let alone American combat forces. And if China was to invade Taiwan, well, then America would be there as well. Now, the reason I bring up this dissent in the United States here is because even though it's a minority today, it's likely to be a majority in November. President Biden's approval ratings are absolutely diabolical. On the back of inflation, fuel prices, the terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's highly probable that the Republicans will wrest control of the House and the Senate in the midterms, and a lot of the new faces will be Trump Republicans looking to rein in spending and invest at home. Combine this with some circles in France and Germany who have been calling for Ukraine to negotiate a peace. They're arguing that it's very unlikely that Russian forces will be pushed out of the east of the country militarily, and therefore it's incumbent to stop the bloodshed as soon as possible. Now, the generous interpretation of this is that they want to end the human misery that's happening out there. But a more realistic assessment is that they're simply cowards. I mean, the Ukrainians want nothing more than the restitution of their sovereign borders and recompense for the brutal and savage and illegal invasion of its territory by the Russian army. And so it's totally immoral to call upon them to negotiate the peace. It's Russia who is the aggressor. And if the war was to end tomorrow, Russia could do this simply by withdrawing. And this combines skepticism that in the United States of being embroiled in failed foreign adventures, and that of the Europeans saying that it's unlikely that the Russians can be defeated in the east of Ukraine. Well, that is having an effect on the war. Russia is hoping to negotiate a peace, and I am still talking to Russians, and my interlocutors there are basically saying, yes, now is the time to negotiate a peace wherein Russia gets something and Ukraine gets something and everyone goes on with their lives. But that's exactly what Russia is hoping for at this point. This war has lasted way longer at a vastly greater expense and cost in blood and treasure than they ever imagined. And this is the best opportunity that they have to come away with something resembling a success. And what I would say is that now is the time to really turn the screws. Give Ukraine the offensive weapons it needs to go on the attack. And there are two things that Ukraine needs to do this. One is ongoing military support so they can hold their own. And second is support for their military industrial complex. The Americans have made it clear that they're not going to provide heavy armored tanks and aircraft to the Ukrainian forces. And the reason for that is it could give the Russians their view that America has joined the fight directly. If you see all this heavy armor from the United States, and meaning that Russia could then potentially employ nuclear weapons in this conflict. Now, that's an analysis for another day, but if the Americans aren't going to provide that kind of equipment, that allows the Ukrainians to develop heavy armored divisions, things that can fight the Russian armed forces over open terrain, that it's essential that the Ukrainian military industrial complex, its factories, go into 24-hour overdrive with the support of other countries to produce its own tanks and its own aircraft to be able to defeat the Russian army in a straight-up conventional fight. This is the moment of Russia's greatest weakness, where they've curtailed their objectives to the most narrow possible focus in the hopes of achieving a political outcome. This is the moment to strike. So I hope that the Europeans, the Americans, can all get on the same page going forward. Whoever wins in the midterms or whoever wins in the elections in Central and Western Europe, to be able to say the objective here is the total destruction of Russia's armed forces in Ukraine, and they're pushing out no matter where they are on sovereign Ukrainian territory. And if that message is made clear, then that will only give Russia a greater incentive to withdraw. And things like the fundraisers by the Lithuanians, who are providing Bayraktar drones to the Ukrainian armed forces, is an extraordinary development in that space. Laisvay TV is also funded through Contribui, which is where our supporters can go to provide support to our channel, Baltic World. We'll leave a link in the description. If you want to support us, you can do it via that platform. We provide special content exclusively for Contribui members. Otherwise, if you found value in this discussion and analysis, please leave a like, share this video. It helps grow the channel a ton. I will see you next time. Thank you for everything. Goodbye.